"You smell like a barn," the college boy said. "Like actual manure." The whole diner laughed, every single one of them. Then he reached out and grabbed her shirt pocket. Something small fell into the mud outside the open door. A white handkerchief. Her dead mother's, the only thing she had left of her. Josephine Hargrove didn't yell, didn't cry. She knelt down in that mud, picked it up with both hands and folded it clean. Then she looked him straight in the eye. "You still have a chance to take that back," she said. He laughed harder. 3 days later, the doors of the town hall swung open. A woman walked in wearing that same face, same eyes, same quiet. But this one had 2 federal agents walking behind her. Because nobody in that town knew Joe Hargrove had a twin sister. And nobody knew what that sister used to do for a living.
The sun comes up slow over Millbrook, Iowa. It always does, same as it has for 100 years. Mist sits low over the cornfields. A rooster calls somewhere past the tree line. And Josephine Hargrove is already awake. She has been awake since 4:30. Farm mornings don't wait for anybody. Joe pulls on her boots by the back door. The wood creaks under her feet, same spot it's creaked for 20 years. Her grandfather is still asleep. She likes it that way. Let the old man rest, she thinks. He's earned it. Joe loads the truck herself. Crates of tomatoes, baskets of sweet corn, jars of honey from the hives out back. Her hands are rough, calloused from years of work, but steady, always steady. The dog follows her to the gate, an old blue heeler named Duke, gray around the muzzle now. He doesn't come along anymore, just watches her go, tail low and steady. "Guard the porch," Joe tells him, same as every morning. Duke sits down in the gravel and waits. He'll be there when she gets back. He always is. The morning air still carries last night's cool, though it won't last past 8. By noon, the heat will settle heavy over the valley, same as every July for as long as Joe can remember. She's learned to love mornings the way some people love the last quiet minute before an alarm goes off. A pocket of peace before the day asks anything of you. Joe drives the same road into town every morning, past the Miller place where old Hank Miller waves from his tractor without ever slowing down, past the old grain elevator that hasn't run since she was a girl, its metal sides rusted the color of dried blood. The radio in the truck only gets 2 stations out here. She doesn't turn it on. She likes the quiet, likes hearing the crates rattle in the back and the tires hum against blacktop. Some mornings she talks to her mother, not out loud, just in her head, the way you talk to somebody you miss more than you let on. This morning she doesn't say much of anything, just drives and watches the fog burn off the fields and thinks about nothing at all. Millbrook isn't much to look at. One main street, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign, a church with a white steeple that's needed fresh paint for going on 6 years, a gas station that still sells a candy bar for 50 cents, if you know to ask for it by name. And Ruth Dalton's diner, right in the middle of it all. That's where Joe is headed now. Ruth has bought vegetables from the Hargrove farm for 15 years, since before Joe's parents passed. It's a quiet arrangement, no paperwork, just a handshake and trust. Trust still means something in a town like this, at least it used to. Joe backs the truck up to the diner's side door just after 6. The morning air smells like coffee and bacon grease. Ruth pokes her head out, flour on her apron already. "Morning, sweetheart," Ruth says. "Corn looks good this week. Picked it myself yesterday," Joe says. "Still has the dew on it." They carry the crates in together. Ruth's hands aren't as strong as they used to be. Joe doesn't mention it. Some things you just do without being asked. Inside the diner is filling up, early risers, farmers, a couple of truckers passing through on the highway. And in the corner booth, 4 college boys home for the summer. Joe doesn't know most of them. 3 boys she's never seen before, probably friends from his university, home for the summer with nothing to do but look for entertainment. But she knows the one in the middle, Cole Ashford. Everybody in Millbrook knows the Ashford name. It's stitched onto half the buildings downtown. The Ashford name is on checks that keep the town hall lights on. Cole just finished his first year at some big university out east. He came back different, bigger talk, bigger opinions, a voice made for an audience. He's telling a story to his friends. Something about a party, something about a professor he made look foolish. His friends laugh on cue. The way people laugh when they need something from you. Jo carries the last crate past their table. She doesn't look at them. She never does. It's not worth the trouble. But trouble has a way of finding people who don't go looking for it. "Well, look who it is," Cole says, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Iowa's finest supermodel." A ripple of laughter from his friends. Jo keeps walking, sets the crate down by the counter. "I'm talking to you, farm girl," Cole says. She turns around, meets his eyes, doesn't say anything yet. That's the first mistake people make with Jo Hargrove. They think her silence means she has nothing to say. "You smell like a barn," Cole says. "Did you know that? Like actual manure." One of his friends, a lanky boy in a fraternity t-shirt, snorts into his orange juice. "Give her a break, man," says another boy, the quietest of the group. His voice is small. Nobody listens to it. "I'm not doing anything," Cole says, grinning at his friends. "Just making conversation. That's allowed, isn't it? Free country." More laughter. Ruth, behind the counter, stops moving. An old trucker near the window lowers his newspaper an inch, watching over the top of it. The whole diner has gone quiet in that particular way. The way a room goes quiet when it knows something bad is coming and doesn't know how to stop it. Jo picks up an empty crate, starts to walk toward the door. She's not running, she's just not staying for this, but Cole isn't done yet. Boys like Cole are rarely done when they've got an audience. He reaches out as she passes, grabs the corner of her shirt pocket. Something small falls out, lands in a puddle of mud just outside the propped open door. A handkerchief. White cotton edges going soft with age. A small embroidered letter J in the corner, stitched by hands that aren't around anymore. It was Jo's mother's, one of the only things left of her. "Oops," Cole says. He isn't sorry. His voice makes that very clear. For 1 second, the whole diner watches to see what Jo will do. Ruth's hand goes to her mouth. One trucker sets down his coffee cup like he might stand up. Jo doesn't yell, doesn't cry, doesn't reach for Cole's collar the way half the room expects. She walks outside, kneels down in the mud, picks up her mother's handkerchief with both hands, gentle as if it were something alive. She wipes it against her jeans, folds it, slides it back into her pocket. Then she turns around and looks at Cole through the open door. "You still have a chance to take that back," she says. Her voice is quiet, almost soft, but it lands like a dropped stone in still water. Cole blinks. For half a second, something flickers behind his eyes, something almost like doubt. Then his friends laugh again, and the doubt disappears, buried under the need to look tough in front of them. "Take back what?" Cole says. "The truth." Jo doesn't answer. She picks up her empty crates, loads them into the truck, and starts the drive home. She doesn't speed. She doesn't cry, either. Not where anyone can see. That's not how Jo was raised. Behind her, inside the diner, the quiet boy leans toward Cole. "That was messed up," he mutters. "Her mom's dead, man. Everybody knows that." Cole's smile falters for just a second, a flicker gone as fast as it came. "She's fine," Cole says louder than he needs to. "People around here are tough. That's the whole point of this place, right? Tough as an old boot." Nobody answers him. The fraternity boy goes back to his eggs. The quiet one stares out the window, watching Jo's truck pull out of the lot. Ruth Dalton refills coffee cups down the counter, hands trembling just slightly, saying nothing at all. She'll think about that nothing for a long time to come. 2 farmers near the window fold their newspapers and leave without finishing their eggs, unable to shake the discomfort of what they just watched. One of them, a heavy-set man named Gus, mutters something under his breath about kids these days as he pays his bill, though he doesn't say a word to Cole directly on his way out. Small towns are like that sometimes. Plenty of people notice. Not many people say anything. Opal Fenwick walks into the diner about 20 minutes later, same as she does most mornings, and knows something's wrong before she even sits down. Opal is 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and has lived in Millbrook her whole life. She doesn't miss much. "Ruth, honey, you all right?" she asks, sliding onto her usual stool at the counter. "I'm fine," Ruth says, though her hands are shaking slightly as she pours coffee. "You don't look fine," Opal says. "You look like a woman carrying something she doesn't want to carry." Ruth sets the pot down, takes a breath. "That Ashford boy," she starts. "Not 10 minutes ago, with Joe Hargrove." "What happened?" Opal asks, already leaning in. "He threw her mama's handkerchief in the mud," Ruth says quietly. "Right there, in front of everybody, and I just stood there, didn't say a word." Opal reaches over and pats Ruth's hand. "You've got the Ashford name plastered all over your ceiling, Lone," Opal says. "Nobody blames you for being careful." "That doesn't make it right," Ruth says. She wipes down the counter, though it's already clean. Her hands need something to do. "None of us are as brave as we like to think we are," Opal says, "until the day comes when we have to be." Ruth glances toward the window, toward the muddy patch of gravel outside where Joe's handkerchief had landed. "I've known that girl since she was in diapers," Ruth says. "Watched her and her sister run barefoot through this parking lot 100 summers. And I just stood there like a coward." "You're no coward, Ruth Dalton," Opal says. "You're a woman with a mortgage and a business to protect. There's a difference, even if it don't feel like one." Ruth doesn't look convinced. Opal is quiet a moment, stirring cream into her coffee. "You know," she says slowly, "hearing that girl walked away, calm as anything, handkerchief and all, it reminds me of something." "Reminds you of what?" Ruth asks. "Her sister," Opal says. "Eleanor. The one who left?" Ruth frowns. "Eleanor left for college, didn't she?" "Years back." Opal shakes her head slowly. "That's what everybody says," Opal replies. "But I remember the day she left. Wasn't no college acceptance letter that came for that girl. Was a different kind of letter altogether. Men in uniform came out to that farm not long after." Ruth stares at her. "What are you saying, Opal?" "I'm not saying anything," Opal says, sipping her coffee. "I'm just an old woman with a long memory, that's all. But something in her eyes says she's holding back more than she's letting on. I remember those two girls used to finish each other's sentences," Opal goes on almost to herself. "Couldn't tell them apart in church half the time. Not till one of them started standing just a little different from the other. More still. More watchful, like she was always checking the doors and windows, even sitting in a pew." "Which one was that?" Ruth asks. Opal thinks about it a moment. "That's the strange part," she says. "I couldn't ever tell you for certain which one it was." "You ever ask either of them about it?" Ruth says. "Ask a Hargrove a direct question," Opal says, almost smiling. "That family answers exactly what they want to answer and not one word more. Comes from losing their parents so young, I expect. You learn to hold things close." "Seems like an awful lot for one young woman to carry alone," Ruth says. "A farm, a grandfather getting on in years, and whatever else is sitting behind those quiet eyes of hers." "She's not as alone as she thinks she is," Opal says. "None of us are, really. Just takes something breaking loose sometimes for people to remember that." She finishes her coffee, sets a few dollars on the counter, and pats Ruth's hand once more on her way out the door. Ruth stands there a long while after turning that conversation over in her mind, feeling more unsettled than she can rightly explain. Back at the Hargrove farm, Walter is up now, sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching the fields wake up. Walter Hargrove is 78 years old, built like an old fence post, weathered but still standing straight. He's the one who raised Joe after the accident took her parents. A tractor rollover on a wet hillside 13 years ago. Joe was 14. Her twin sister Eleanor was 14 too. 2 little girls and 1 old man left to run 300 acres. Joe remembers that day in pieces, the way memory holds on to some things and lets go of others. She remembers the rain, remembers her mother's boots by the door still muddy and nobody ever moving them. She remembers Eleanor holding her hand at the funeral so tight it left marks. Neither of them cried in front of anyone. They saved that for later, alone in the room they shared. Walter didn't say much those first months. He just showed up every morning before sunrise and worked until his hands bled. He taught two frightened 14-year-old girls how to run a tractor, how to read weather in the clouds, how to keep going when your whole world had just fallen out from under you. He taught them other things too, things that had nothing to do with farming. How to change a tire on the shoulder of a dark road, how to shoot straight enough to scare off a coyote without wasting a bullet, how to look a hard year in the eye and not blink first. Most people said the farm wouldn't survive the year. Most people were wrong. "You're back early," Walter says as Joe pulls up. "Ruth didn't need much today," Joe says. She doesn't mention the diner, doesn't mention Cole, doesn't mention the handkerchief still folded tight in her pocket. Walter watches her face a moment too long. He's known that face since the day she was born. He knows when something's sitting behind it. "You want to tell me? Or you want to let it eat at you?" he asks. Joe almost smiles. Almost. "It's nothing, Grandpa," she says. "Just some kid running his mouth." "Ashford kid?" Walter asks. Joe doesn't answer. She doesn't have to. Walter's jaw tightens. He knew Richard Ashford back when Richard was still driving a beat-up truck and dreaming about being somebody. Now Richard owns half the county and acts like he owns the other half too. "That family," Walter mutters. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. Richard Ashford grew up 2 farms down from Walter, back when the Ashfords didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. Walter remembers Richard's father, a hard-drinking man who lost his own land to the bank in the 80s. Richard swore, standing at that auction as a boy, that nobody would ever take anything from him again. Somewhere along the way, that promise curdled into something else, something that took instead of protected. Now Richard owns the feed store, the old cinema building, half the storefronts on Main Street, and more farmland outside town than anybody in the county. He calls it progress. Walter calls it something else. "Man's been circling this valley for 2 years now," Walter says, "buying up the Hendersons, the Wallace place, even got old Pete Sorensen to sell, and Pete swore he'd die on that land." "We're not selling," Joe says. "Never said we were," Walter answers, "but holding out gets harder when you're the last one standing." They sit with that a moment, coffee going cold between them. The morning sun climbing higher over fields neither of them can imagine belonging to anybody else. Around noon, a mail truck comes up the drive. Rare this time of day, rarer still on a farm road like this one. The mail carrier hands Walter a thick envelope, cream-colored. Expensive paper, the kind of paper regular folks don't usually buy. Walter opens it right there on the porch steps. Joe watches his face change as he reads. "What is it?" she asks. Walter hands her the letter without a word. It's from Ashford Land Holdings, Richard Ashford's company. A formal offer to purchase the Hargrove farm. Fair market value, the letter says. Generous terms, it says. But underneath the polite language, there's something else. A deadline. This offer remains valid for 72 hours. After the town council vote on Friday evening, all outstanding parcels will be acquired through eminent domain proceedings as authorized under the Millbrook Economic Development Initiative. Joe reads it twice, then a third time, slower. Eminent domain, she says. They can't just take the land. They can if the council votes to call this whole valley a blighted area, Walter says. That's what this initiative is. That's what Friday's vote is about. Since when? Since Richard Ashford started buying up half the town council with campaign donations, Walter says. His voice is low, tired. Joe folds the letter carefully. Her hands are steady even now. They're not taking this farm, she says. Walter looks at her. There's something in her voice he hasn't heard in a long time. Not anger, exactly. Something calmer than anger. Something that sounds almost like certainty. Joe, he says slowly, you've been awful calm today. Awful calm for someone who just got humiliated in front of half the town. Joe doesn't answer that either. She just looks out at the fields, green and gold stretching toward the horizon her whole life has been measured against. I've got chores, she says, and walks toward the barn. Walter watches her go. An old worry stirs in his chest, one he hasn't felt in 13 years. He glances toward the house, toward a locked cedar chest tucked away in the hall closet, a chest he hasn't opened since Joe was 18 years old. He doesn't go near it. Not yet. That afternoon, while Joe is out in the fields, Walter sits alone in the hallway, one hand resting on the closet door. He doesn't open it, just rests his palm flat against the wood the way a man might rest his hand on a headstone. Inside that chest sits a folder of paperwork he was asked to keep all those years ago. Emergency contact forms, a power of attorney document signed and notarized naming him as next of kin for 2 young women instead of 1. He remembers the day the recruiter drove out to the farm personally, hat in his hands, asking permission for 2 18-year-old girls to serve their country. Walter remembers saying yes before either of the girls had even finished asking. He remembers, too, the quieter conversation that happened later that same week. The one where one twin came to him privately and said she couldn't leave. Said the farm needed her more than any uniform did. Walter had held her hands that day and told her nothing in this world made him prouder. Not the choice she almost made. The choice she actually made instead. He still believes that 13 years later, sitting in this hallway with his hand on a locked door. But watching Joe come back from town that morning quiet, in a way that wasn't quite her usual quiet, he can't shake the feeling that some things buried in cedar chests have a way of finding daylight again, whether you're ready for them or not. He gets up slowly, joints protesting the way they always do now, and goes to check on the fields himself. Out past the barn, Joe works the rest of the afternoon, mending a stretch of fence that's needed attention since spring. She drives each post deeper than it needs to be, like the ground itself might give her some kind of answer if she just worked it hard enough. She thinks about the letter folded in her back pocket. About 72 hours, already ticking down toward something she can't quite picture yet. About a whole valley of families who'd already given up and sold one by one until it was just her and Grandpa standing between Richard Ashford and everything he wanted. She doesn't cry. She doesn't rage, either. She just works the way she's always worked, through the hardest parts of her life, letting her hands find a rhythm her mind can follow along behind. By the time the sun starts sliding west, the fence is tighter than it's been in years, and Joe still doesn't have any answers. But she has something almost as useful. A clear head and a plan starting to take shape in the quiet corners of her mind. That afternoon, Sheriff Dan Whitfield drives out to the edge of town, parks his cruiser under an old oak tree, and stares out at nothing in particular. He's been sheriff of this county for 22 years, long enough to bury 3 predecessors and swear in half the deputies working for him now. Long enough to remember when Millbrook had a movie theater, a working feed mill, and a 4th of July parade that shut down Main Street for a whole afternoon. Long enough to remember Walter Hargrove pulling him out of a burning barn back in 1987, back when they were both young men who thought they were invincible. Whitfield had driven past the old Henderson place just that morning. Empty now. A for sale sign from some development company already staked into the front yard, right next to a mailbox shaped like a rooster that Carol Henderson had painted herself 20 years back. Bill and Carol Henderson had farmed that land for 35 years. Now they were renting a duplex on the edge of Fairview, and nobody in town quite talked about how that happened. Whitfield doesn't like thinking about what comes next for the Hargrove place if Friday's vote goes the way Richard Ashford wants it to. His phone buzzes. Richard Ashford's name lights up the screen. He lets it ring twice before answering. "Whitfield," he says. "Dan, got a minute?" Richard's voice is smooth, as always, practiced. "Depends what you need," Whitfield says. "Just want to make sure everything stays orderly this week," Richard says. "Before the vote Friday. Wouldn't want any incidents disrupting things." "Incidents like what?" "Like farmers getting riled up, making noise at the council meeting, that sort of thing," Richard says. "You understand." Whitfield stares out the windshield at the empty road ahead. He's known Walter Hargrove for over 40 years. Served next to him on the volunteer fire department back before either of them had gray hair. I understand people have a right to speak at a public meeting, Richard, Whitfield says carefully. There's a pause on the line, not a friendly one. Of course they do, Richard says finally. I just want to make sure things stay civil, that's all I'm asking. I'll keep the peace, Whitfield says, same as I always do. That's all I ask, Richard says, and hangs up. Whitfield sits there a long moment, phone in his lap, staring at nothing. He doesn't like the feeling settling into his stomach, hasn't liked it for weeks now, ever since Richard Ashford started calling more often than a sheriff usually gets called. He thinks about Walter pulling him out of that fire 30-some years ago, dragging him 20 feet across smoking hay by the collar of his shirt. He thinks about the vote coming Friday, about the kind of man he wants to be able to look at in the mirror come Saturday morning. He starts the engine and pulls back onto the road. Something is coming to Millbrook. He can feel it the way old farmers feel weather before it arrives, a pressure in the air that has nothing to do with clouds. He just doesn't know yet how bad the storm will be. 2 counties over, in a town called Fairview, Cole Ashford is sitting in his father's study. Richard Ashford sits behind a wide oak desk, papers spread out in front of him. Maps of Millbrook and the surrounding farmland sections marked in red ink. You embarrassed yourself today, Richard says, not looking up. Cole shifts in his chair. It was just talk. Everybody was laughing. Everybody laughs at everything when they're scared to say no, Richard says. That's not the same as respect. Cole doesn't answer. He's used to these conversations where he can never quite win. That Hargrove girl, Richard says. Her family's the last holdout on the north parcel, her and that old man. So, Cole says, what's that got to do with me? Richard finally looks up. His eyes are cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who spent 30 years turning other people's misfortune into his own opportunity. Richard taps a finger against the map along the northern edge marked in red. 12 families in this valley, he says. 11 of them already signed. The Hendersons folded last month once I explained what unpaid property taxes look like after a county reassessment. The Wallace place took a little longer, but money has a way of loosening even stubborn hands eventually. And the Hargroves are the last ones, Cole says. The Hargroves are the last ones, Richard agrees. One old man and a girl running 300 acres on a wing and a prayer should have been the easiest signature in the whole valley. So make them an offer, Cole says. A good one. I did, Richard says. Fair market value plus 20%. More money than that farm has seen in a decade. And you know what the old man said? Cole shakes his head. Nothing, Richard says. Didn't even bother responding. Like money doesn't mean anything to people like that. Maybe it doesn't, Cole says quietly. Richard looks at him like he's said something foolish. Everything means something to everyone, son, Richard says. You just haven't found the right pressure point yet. That's what you're going to help me find this week. Why me? Because you're my son, Richard says like it's the most obvious answer in the world. And because come Friday, I need that vote to go my way. Every acre, no exceptions. You're going to keep an eye on that family this week, quietly. See what rattles them, see what makes them nervous. And if they don't want to sell? Richard leans back in his chair. A thin smile crosses his face. People always want to sell, he says. Sooner or later. You just have to make sure later doesn't come. Cole nods slowly. He doesn't like the way this feels, though he couldn't say exactly why. But he doesn't argue either. He never does. Not with his father. Later that night, alone in his childhood bedroom, Cole sits on the edge of his bed and scrolls through his phone without really seeing it. He thinks about the girl in the diner, the way she'd knelt down in the mud without a word of complaint, the way she'd looked at him afterward, calm as still water, and said he still had a chance to take it back. Nobody had ever looked at him quite like that before, not scared, not angry, just disappointed in a way that sat heavier than either of those things would have. He tells himself it doesn't matter. Tells himself she's nobody, just some farm girl who'll forget about it by next week. He almost believes it. Almost. He puts his phone down, turns off the light, and lies awake a long while listening to his father's voice still echoing in his head. Make sure later doesn't come. He doesn't know exactly what that means yet. Not really. He's about to find out. The quiet boy from the diner, the one who told Cole to give her a break, drives out that same evening to the feed store to fill up his truck on the edge of town. His name is Danny Rourke, and he grew up 2 towns over, close enough to know how small-town gossip travels, far enough to still feel like an outsider watching it happen. The old man behind the counter ringing up his gas mentions the whole thing without being asked. Word about the diner had already reached him twice that day. "Shame what happened to that Hargrove girl," the old man says, shaking his head. "Good family. Lost her folks young. Raised herself up right, anyway." Danny doesn't say anything, just nods, pays for his gas, and drives back toward the Ashford place with a knot sitting heavy in his stomach. He thinks about Cole's laugh in that diner, about how easy it had been to laugh along even when some part of him knew it was wrong. He doesn't know what he's going to do about it yet, but something in him has already decided he isn't going to laugh along next time. He drives the rest of the way home slower than usual, windows down, letting the warm evening air do something to settle the knot in his stomach. It doesn't quite work. Some knots don't come loose until you actually do something about them. Back at the Hargrove farm, evening settles, slow and gold over the fields. Jo walks the fence line alone, checking for gaps, same as she does most evenings. It's quiet work, thinking work. Her mind keeps drifting back to the letter, to the 72 hours ticking away somewhere behind her ribs. She thinks about her grandfather's tired eyes on the porch that morning, about how much this land means to him, how much it's meant to her whole family for 4 generations. She thinks about Cole Ashford's laugh in that diner, the way it echoed off the walls like it belonged there more than she did. By the time she finishes the fence line, the light has gone soft and gold, and she heads back toward the house for supper. Over a meal of fried chicken and green beans from the garden, Walter watches Jo pick at her food more than eat it. "Your grandmother used to say something," Walter says, breaking the silence, "whenever times got hard on this farm. You remember?" Jo shakes her head slightly. "She'd say this land don't belong to us," Walter says. "We belong to it. For a while, anyway. Then we hand it on to whoever comes next, and hope we left it better than we found it." "That's a nice thought," Jo says quietly. "It's more than a nice thought," Walter says. "It's the whole reason I never once considered selling to men like Richard Ashford. Not because of stubbornness, because this dirt's got 4 generations of Hargroves buried in the family plot out past the north field. You don't sell that. Not for any amount of money." Jo nods, slowly staring down at her plate. "You've been quiet since that letter came," Walter says. "Quieter than usual, even for you." "Just thinking, Grandpa," Jo says. "About the farm?" "About a lot of things," Jo says. Walter studies her a long moment, the way he's studied her whole life, reading things in her face that she never quite says out loud. "You know," he says slowly, "your sister called me last week, asked how you were doing." Jo looks up, surprised. "She didn't mention that to me." "Maybe she wanted my honest answer," Walter says, "not the one you'd want me to give her." "And what did you tell her?" Walter is quiet a moment. "I told her you were carrying more than your share, same as always," he says. "And then I worried about you the same way I used to worry about her back before she found her own way to carry things." Jo doesn't answer that. She just reaches over and squeezes her grandfather's weathered hand the way she has 1,000 times before. By the time supper is over and the dishes are dried and put away, Jo feels the weight of the day settling into her shoulders the way it always does. Tired in the body, restless in the mind. That night, after the dishes are done and Walter has gone to bed, Jo sits alone in her room. She pulls a small wooden box down from her closet shelf. It's plain, unremarkable, the kind of box nobody would look twice at. Inside, wrapped in an old dish towel, sits a photograph. 2 girls, maybe 18 years old, standing side by side in matching gray t-shirts. Both of them have their hair pulled back tight. Both of them are smiling, but tired in a way that goes past a normal day's work. Behind them, a chain-link fence and a row of low buildings. A flag hangs limp in windless air. Jo runs her thumb along the edge of the photograph. She doesn't need to look closely. She's memorized every detail. That was the day they both went to the recruiter's office in Fairview, 18 years old, wearing borrowed confidence like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. They'd signed up together, ran the same practice drills together in the fields behind the barn, timing each other with Walter's old stopwatch. Two farm girls who could outrun half the boys in their graduating class and never once talked about it in town. Eleanor sailed through every test they gave her. Jo did too, if she's honest with herself. That's a truth she doesn't share with many people. But on the morning they were supposed to leave together, Jo stood in the driveway and looked back at the farmhouse. At Walter, on the porch. 70 years old even then, trying so hard to look like a man who didn't need anybody's help. She couldn't do it. Couldn't leave him alone with 300 acres and a heart that had already survived one funeral too many. Someone has to stay, she told Eleanor that morning. Someone has to keep this place standing for him. Eleanor had looked at her for a long moment, eyes wet, and then hugged her hard enough to hurt. "You're just as strong as me," Eleanor said. "Maybe stronger. Don't you ever let anybody tell you different." Jo hadn't believed her, not back then. Next to the photo, wrapped separately, sits a small metal patch, faded green and black. A single word stitched along the bottom edge, half worn away by years of handling. Eleanor sent it home years later, tucked inside a birthday card, no explanation attached. Jo never asked why. Some things you just understand without needing the words spelled out. Jo holds it for a long moment, then puts it back exactly where it belongs. She checks the clock. 9 o'clock, almost to the minute. She picks up her phone and steps outside onto the porch where the night air is cool and nobody can overhear. The call connects after 2 rings. "It's me," Jo says quietly. A pause on the other end, then a voice, low and even, comes through. "Status?" "Nothing to report," Jo says. "Situation stable, for now." Another pause, longer this time. "You sound different tonight," the voice says. Jo glances back at the dark farmhouse windows. "Ashford's making his move," she says. "Sent a letter, 72 hours before the council vote." "And the other thing?" the voice asks. "The one from this morning?" Jo hesitates. "How did you already hear about that?" "Small towns talk fast," the voice says. "Faster than you'd think." Jo looks down at the porch boards under her boots. "It's handled," she says. "It's nothing I can't manage." "That's what you said about the last thing, too," the voice says. Not accusing, just observing. "This is different," Jo says. "It's always different," the voice answers. "Definition until it isn't." There's a long silence between them, comfortable in the way silence only is between people who've known each other their whole lives. "Whitfield's getting calls," Jo adds, "from Ashford, wanting the peace kept Friday." "That's not a good sign," the voice says. "None of this is a good sign," Jo says. "You holding up all right?" the voice asks, softer now. "I'm always all right," Jo says. "That's not what I asked." Jo looks out at the dark tree line at the edge of the property, silent a moment. "It's been a long day," she admits finally. "Those are the ones that count," the voice says. "The long ones. Anybody can hold it together on an easy day." "You still coming home for the harvest?" Jo asks finally. "When I can," the voice says. "You know how it is." "I know how it is," Jo echoes. "Take care of Grandpa," the voice says. "And Jo, don't let that boy get inside your head, whoever he is." "I never do," Jo says. "I know," the voice answers. "That's what worries me." The call ends. Jo stands on the porch a moment longer, looking out at the dark fields, listening to the crickets and the wind moving through the corn. Somewhere out there, 72 hours are already ticking down. She has no idea yet how many more they're going to need. She reaches into her pocket, feels the soft edge of her mother's handkerchief cleaned and folded neat. Her mother used to say something to her back when Joe was small enough to sit on her lap during church. Gentleness isn't weakness, baby girl. Gentleness is just strength that hasn't been asked for yet. Joe hadn't understood it then. She thinks she's starting to understand it now. Some things you protect no matter what it costs you, she thinks. Land, family, the people who can't protect themselves. She doesn't know yet how much all of that is about to be tested. She doesn't know that Cole Ashford, humiliated by his own father's disappointment, is already planning to make her family's week a great deal worse. She doesn't know that a 9 o'clock phone call 3 days from now will bring someone back to Millbrook that this town has not seen in a very long time. All she knows, standing on that porch, as the last of the lamplight flickers behind her, is that she made a promise once. A promise to protect this place. To protect the people who can't stand up for themselves. And Josephine Hargrove has never once broken a promise in her life. Duke rises from his spot by the porch steps and falls into step beside her as she heads for the door, the way he's done every evening for 11 years. Joe scratches behind his ears without looking down. Some habits don't need thinking about. She stops at the bottom of the porch steps and looks back one more time at the fields. She thinks about her grandfather and Eleanor's voice on the phone, steady and far away. About the patch in that wooden box waiting quietly for a day it might be needed again. She thinks about Cole Ashford's laugh and the flicker of doubt behind his eyes, and wonders if there's still a version of that boy who could learn something worth learning if somebody ever gave him the chance. Most of all, she thinks about her grandfather, about everything he built with his own 2 hands out of grief and stubbornness and love back when 2 frightened 14-year-old girls were all he had left in the world. Land can be measured in acres, but some things on this farm were never really about the dirt at all. They were about showing up every single day for the people who need you. About choosing kindness even when the world hands you every excuse not to. About standing quiet and steady when everything in you wants to shout, because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply refuse to become what's hurting them. Joe climbs the porch steps slowly, Duke padding along beside her. Somewhere, out past the horizon, 72 hours keep ticking down, quiet as the wind through the corn, patient as a storm, still gathering. She has no idea yet how many more hours they're going to need, or how far this fight is about to reach beyond her own front gate. She only knows one thing for certain, standing there under a sky full of Iowa stars. She isn't going anywhere. Not while there's still a farm to protect and people worth protecting it for. Inside, a lamp glows warm in the kitchen window. Walter's shadow moves past it once, then settles. An old man getting ready for bed on a farm that's stood for 4 generations, not knowing yet how much is about to be asked of the people who love it. Joe lets the door close soft behind her, Duke settling onto the rug by the stove with a heavy sigh, and climbs the stairs to bed. Tomorrow will come whether she's ready for it or not. That much, at least, has never once changed about this farm, or this town, or this life she chose to stay and build. Wednesday morning comes to Millbrook gray, and still, like the whole town is holding its breath. Joe is up before dawn again, same as always, but something feels different today. Heavier, somehow, though nothing has actually changed yet. 50-some hours left by her count. She does the math without meaning to, the way you count anything that scares you a little. The house feels different this morning. Quieter than usual, though nothing has changed except the number sitting behind her eyes. She feeds the hens, checks the water trough, walks the fence line with Duke trotting along beside her, nose down, tail wagging at nothing in particular. The corn stands tall on either side of the path, green, going gold at the tips already, another few weeks from harvest. Joe runs her hand along the stalks as she passes, an old habit, checking for anything that shouldn't be there. Everything looks the same as it always has. That's the strange part. The world doesn't usually announce when it's about to change. She thinks about the call she'll make again tonight, same as every night, same time, same short exchange of words that mean more than they say. It's become a small anchor in an otherwise unsteady week, knowing that voice will be there at 9 o'clock, no matter what. Walter is quieter than usual over breakfast. He keeps glancing at the letter still sitting on the kitchen table where he set it the day before. "You sleep all right?" Joe asks. "Well enough," Walter says, though the shadows under his eyes say otherwise. Neither of them mentions the deadline out loud. Some things get heavier the more you say them. "You heading into town today?" Walter asks, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate more than eating them. "Later," Joe says. "Fence needs another look first, and I want to check on that heifer that's been favoring her back leg." "You work too hard," Walter says. "Learned it from somebody," Joe says, and manages the first real smile of the morning. Walter almost smiles back. Almost. He pushes his chair back slower than usual, joints stiff from a night that clearly didn't treat him well, and shuffles out to the porch to catch what's left of the cool morning air before the heat sets in. Joe watches him go, noting the careful way he holds the door frame, the slight favor in his left side. He thinks she hasn't noticed. She's been noticing it for weeks now, quietly, the way you notice a fence post starting to lean before it finally gives. She doesn't say anything, not yet. Some worries you carry alone, a little longer, hoping they'll prove themselves wrong before you have to speak them out loud. At the diner that morning, the whole town seems to be talking about the same thing, in low voices, over coffee cups and half-eaten toast. "Heard the council's got the votes already lined up," says one farmer near the window. "Ashford's had 3 members over to his place for dinner this month alone." "Don't seem right," another one answers. "Man buying his way into taking people's land?" A younger woman 2 stools down, home visiting her parents for the summer, shakes her head slowly. "My folks sold out to him last spring," she says quietly. "Said it was the only sensible thing to do with prices the way they are. Still, my mother drives past that empty house every time she visits and cries about it. Say what you want about sensible. Some things you don't get back once they're gone." Nobody answers that right away. It sits there a moment, heavy and true, the way certain quiet sentences do in a small-town diner. Ruth listens to all of it while she works, saying little, her mind still turning over what Opal told her the day before. Opal herself comes in around 9, same booth as always, and orders her coffee black. "You look like you didn't sleep either," Ruth says, sliding the cup across the counter. "Been thinking about that Hargrove girl," Opal admits. "Couldn't put it out of my mind after what I told you yesterday." "About Eleanor?" Ruth says quietly. "The uniformed men, all of it?" "That's the one," Opal says. "Told you what I remembered and haven't been able to shake it since. Makes a person wonder what else this town's been too polite to ask about." "You think Joe knows we're wondering?" Ruth asks. "Joe Hargrove's known this town was wondering about her family since the day her parents passed," Opal says. "Doesn't mean she owes anybody an answer before she's ready to give one." Ruth nods slowly, wiping down the counter, out of habit more than need. Down the far end of the counter, 2 older farmers are talking low over their pie heads bent together. "Council votes Friday," one of them says. "Blighted area designation, they're calling it. My cousin over in Fairview says once that passes, the county can take land for pennies on the dollar. That land's been in some of these families longer than this whole town's been on a map," the other one says. "Don't matter to men like Ashford," the first one answers. "Progress don't look back." Ruth catches pieces of it while she works, feeling her stomach tighten a little more with every word. "Just seems like an awful lot for one young woman to carry alone," Ruth says, turning back to Opal. "A sick, worried grandfather, a family farm under threat, and whatever else is sitting behind those quiet eyes of hers." "She's not as alone as she thinks she is," Opal says. "None of us are, really. Just takes something breaking loose sometimes for people to remember that." Outside, a truck rumbles past on Main Street, and both women glance toward the window out of habit more than curiosity. Earlier that same afternoon, a car sits parked on a quiet stretch of gravel road bordering the Hargrove North pasture, engine off, windows cracked. Cole watches from the passenger seat while one of his fraternity friends, a broad-shouldered boy named Trent, climbs through the ditch toward the fence line with a pair of bolt cutters hidden under his jacket. "You sure about this?" Cole asks, though the question comes late. Trent is already halfway to the fence. "Your dad said make it look like an accident," Trent calls back, not bothering to lower his voice much. "Cattle get loose all the time. Nobody's gonna think twice." Cole watches him work something twisting uncomfortable in his stomach. He thinks about the heifer, gentle-eyed and slow-moving, the same cattle he's seen grazing in that pasture every summer of his life. "Just the fence," Cole says. "Nothing else. You don't touch the animals." "Relax," Trent says, snapping through the second wire. "It's just wire." The cattle, sensing the disturbance, begin to shift and low uneasily, drifting toward the gap in the fence Trent has just created. Cole watches them move, watches one heifer stumble toward the tree line near the creek, and feels something cold settle in his chest that has nothing to do with the weather. "That's enough," he says, more sharply than he means to. "Get back in the car." Trent jogs back, breathing hard, grinning like he's just won something. "Piece of cake," he says, climbing in and tossing the bolt cutters onto the back seat. Cole doesn't answer. He starts the engine and pulls away fast, glancing once in the rearview mirror at the scattering cattle at a farm that never did anything to deserve what's happening to it. He doesn't feel like he won anything at all. Jo is out repairing the same stretch of fence she checked that morning when she hears it, a commotion from the direction of the north pasture, cattle, bawling, something crashing through brush. She drops her tools and runs, boots pounding hard against packed dirt, heart already hammering before she even reaches the tree line. 3 of Walter's cattle have broken through a section of fence and scattered into the tree line bordering the county road, spooked by something. One of them, a young heifer, has gotten herself tangled in old barbed wire near the creek bank, thrashing and panicking, cutting herself worse with every struggle. Blood streaks dark against the animal's pale hide, and her eyes roll wild with fear, legs kicking at nothing, driving the wire deeper with every motion. A car sits idling on the shoulder of the county road, above windows, tinted, engine running. It pulls away fast the moment Jo comes into view. She doesn't chase it. There isn't time. She goes straight to the heifer instead, moving low and calm, the way you approach anything in a panic that could hurt you if you rush it. "Easy," she says, voice steady as still water. "Easy now. I've got you." The animal's eyes are rolled white with fear, legs cut and bleeding where the wire has bitten in deep. Most people would need help handling something this size in this state. Most people would get kicked, or worse. Jo doesn't. She reads the animal's weight shift before it happens, moves with it instead of against it, gets a hand on the wire and works it free with quick, precise motions that look almost rehearsed. Within minutes, the heifer is loose, standing shaky but calm, letting Jo run gentle hands along its wounded legs to check the damage. She doesn't notice the sheriff's cruiser pulling up on the county road above until Whitfield is already climbing down the embankment toward her. "Saw the commotion from the road," Whitfield says, slightly out of breath. "You all right down here?" "We're fine," Jo says, still crouched beside the heifer. "She'll need some stitches, but she'll live." Whitfield watches her work a moment longer, something shifting behind his eyes. He's seen plenty of ranchers handle spooked cattle before. He's never seen anyone do it quite like that. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Just calm, controlled competence, like she'd done this exact thing 100 times in far worse conditions than a creek bank in Iowa. He files that thought away for later, the same way he files away most things that don't quite add up. 22 years of police work teaches a man to notice what doesn't fit even when he can't yet say why. "Somebody cut this fence," Whitfield says, examining the wire. "This ain't old wear. Clean cuts, recent." Jo looks up at him, saying nothing. "You see anybody out here?" he asks. "Car on the road," Jo says. "Left before I got a good look." Whitfield's jaw tightens. He doesn't say Ashford's name out loud. He doesn't need to. Both of them are thinking it. "You want to file a report?" he asks. Jo considers it a long moment, looking at the heifer's wounded legs, at the fence cut clean through in 3 places. "Not yet," she says. "Let's just get her fixed up first." Whitfield nods slowly, though something in his gut tells him this is only the beginning of something much bigger. He helps her walk the cattle back toward the barn, watching the whole time filing away everything he's just seen. By the time he drives off that evening, Sheriff Dan Whitfield has a lot more questions than answers, and a growing feeling that Josephine Hargrove is not exactly who this town has always assumed her to be. That night, Cole Ashford sits in his car outside the Fairview movie theater parking lot, listening to his friend Danny go quiet on the passenger side. "You didn't have to come," Cole says finally. "Your dad asked me to," Danny says. "Same as he asked you." "He didn't ask," Cole mutters. "He doesn't ask for things." "Fine, he told you," Danny says. "Same difference in that house, isn't it?" Cole doesn't answer that. He stares out at the empty parking lot, neon marquee lights flickering against the windshield. Danny stares out the window, jaw tight. "Cutting somebody's fence, Cole," he says, "scaring their cattle onto the county road. That's not pressure, that's just cruelty with extra steps." "Nobody got hurt," Cole says. "An animal got hurt," Danny says. "Could have been Joe Hargrove out there too, and you know it." "Trent handled it," Cole mutters. "I wasn't even out there." "Doesn't make it not your idea," Danny says. "Doesn't make you not part of it sitting in that car watching it happen." Cole's knuckles go white on the steering wheel. "You think I don't know that?" He snaps, then catches himself softening. "Sorry. I don't know how to tell my father no. Never have." Danny is quiet a moment, some of the anger draining out of his voice. "Maybe it's time you learned," he says, "before somebody gets hurt worse than a heifer with a few cuts." Cole doesn't answer that. He just grips the steering wheel a little tighter, staring straight ahead at nothing. "My dad wants this deal closed," he says finally. "Wants it closed clean before Friday. That's all this is." "Nothing about this is clean," Danny says. Cole doesn't argue. He just starts the engine and drives them both home in silence, the radio filling the space where conversation used to be. Neither of them mentions it again that night. But something has shifted between them, quiet and small, the kind of shift that doesn't show itself until much later. That same Wednesday evening in a private dining room at the Fairview Country Club, Richard Ashford hosts 3 members of the Millbrook Town Council over steak dinners and expensive wine. Councilman Ed Buford, a heavy-set man who owns the local insurance agency, laughs a little too loud at something Richard says, the way men laugh when they know exactly who's paying for dinner. "Friday should go smooth," Richard says, cutting into his steak without looking up, "assuming everyone remembers where their priorities lie." "Course it will," Buford says quickly. "You've got my vote, Richard. Always have." The second councilwoman, a quieter woman named Patricia Voss, pushes food around her plate without much appetite. "Some of the farmers are getting restless," she says carefully. "That Hargrove situation especially. People are asking questions about the blight designation." Richard sets down his fork, fixing her with a patient smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. "People always ask questions, Patricia," he says. "Progress has never once waited around for everyone to feel comfortable with it. That resort brings 400 jobs to this county, convention space, tourism dollars this valley hasn't seen in a generation." "I understand that," Patricia says. "I just want to make sure we're doing this the right way." "There is no right way that doesn't ruffle a few feathers," Richard says smoothly. "Only the way that gets done and the way that doesn't. I'd hate to see Millbrook fall behind Fairview because a handful of stubborn farmers couldn't see the bigger picture." Patricia doesn't answer that directly. She just nods slowly, the way people do when they've decided arguing further isn't worth the trouble. Richard watches her a moment longer, satisfied, then raises his wine glass toward the other 2 council members. "To progress," he says. Buford raises his glass eagerly. Patricia lifts hers a half-second slower, eyes lingering on the tablecloth instead of Richard's face. Outside, the summer evening settles gold and quiet over the golf course beyond the windows, entirely unaware of the decisions being made a room away that will shape the fate of an entire farming valley. Back at the Ashford estate, later that night, Richard is waiting in his study when Cole gets home. "Fence trick work?" Richard asks, not looking up from his paperwork. "Cattle got loose," Cole says. Sheriff showed up, asked questions. Richard sets his pen down, finally, looking at his son directly. And what did you tell him? Nothing, Cole says. I wasn't even there. Had somebody else handle it. Good, Richard says. Keep it that way. Distance matters. Cole hesitates in the doorway. Dad, he says, is this really necessary? The fence, the pressure, all of it, can't we just let the vote happen Friday and see what comes of it? Richard leans back in his chair, studying his son the way he might study a business partner who's starting to lose his nerve. You know how many families I've bought out in this county over the years? Richard asks. A lot, Cole says. 43, Richard says. You know how many of them thanked me, eventually, once they saw the check and realized farming was killing them slow anyway? Almost all of them. This is a mercy, son, whether the Hargroves can see that yet or not. Doesn't feel like mercy, Cole says quietly. Mercy rarely does in the moment, Richard says. Ask me again in 5 years. You'll understand by then. Cole doesn't answer. He turns and heads upstairs, Richard's words following him the whole way, sitting uneasy in his chest, like something he swallowed wrong. Thursday morning arrives with a phone call that changes everything. Jo is in the barn mucking out stalls when she hears Walter cry out from the house. A short sound, sharp and wrong, nothing like the sounds a farm usually makes. She drops the shovel and runs. She finds him in the kitchen, one hand braced against the counterface, gone pale and gray, breathing too fast and too shallow. The letter from Ashford Land Holdings sits on the table beside him, still open from where he'd been reading it again that morning, the 72-hour deadline printed in bold black ink. Grandpa? Just dizzy, Walter says, though his voice comes out thin and strained. Give me a minute. But his knees buckle as he says it, and Jo catches him before he hits the floor, easing him down, gentle as she can manage, cradling his head so it doesn't strike the tile. Talk to me, she says, already reaching for her phone. Chest pain. Can you breathe all right? Tight, Walter manages. Feels tight. In my chest. Jo's hands are steady, even now checking his pulse at the wrist, counting silently, her training from all those years ago, rising up automatic and sure beneath the fear. She loosens his collar, props his feet up on a kitchen chair cushion, keeps her voice low and calm even while her own heart pounds hard enough to hurt. You're going to be fine, she tells him, more command than comfort. I've got you. Just breathe slow and easy. She calls for an ambulance, gives the dispatcher clear, calm directions, then kneels beside her grandfather on the kitchen floor, holding his hand. You stay with me, old man, she says, voice firm despite everything shaking loose inside her. You hear me? You don't get to leave me now. Walter manages a weak smile. Wouldn't dream of it, he whispers. The ambulance arrives 12 minutes later, 12 minutes that feel like 12 years to Jo, kneeling on that floor, holding tight to the one family member she has left in this world. At the hospital, once the doctors take Walter back for tests, Jo finds herself alone in a fluorescent-lit hallway, still wearing her work clothes, dirt from that morning's chores still ground into her hands. She steps into the small restroom near the waiting area and stares at herself in the mirror a long moment. A woman she barely recognizes stares back, exhausted, frightened, trying so hard to hold everything together that her shoulders ache from the effort. She runs cold water over her hands, watching the dirt swirl down the drain, wishing it were half as easy to wash away everything else pressing down on her this week. Hold it together, she tells her reflection quietly. Just a little longer. She dries her hands, squares her shoulders, and walks back out to the waiting room, ready to be strong for whoever needs her to be, the way she's been every single day since she was 14 years old. Word spreads through Millbrook fast, the way it always does. By noon, half the town has heard that Walter Hargrove was rushed to the hospital in Fairview. Stress-related, the early word says. His heart strained past what it should have to bear at his age. Ruth closes the diner early that day, drives straight to the hospital with a casserole dish balanced on her passenger seat, the way people in small towns have always shown up for each other. She finds Jo sitting alone in the waiting room, still in her work clothes, dirt still under her fingernails, staring at nothing. Any word? Ruth asks gently, sitting down beside her. Stable, Joe says. They're saying it might have been a mild heart attack, brought on by stress, they think. Ruth reaches over and takes her hand. This isn't your fault, Ruth says. Feels like it is, Joe says quietly. That fence didn't cut itself yesterday, and that letter didn't write itself either. Ruth doesn't have an answer for that. She just sits with her the way you sit with someone when words won't fix anything, but presence might help a little. Opal arrives an hour later, then 2 more farmers whose land borders the Hargrove place, then Danny Rourke, of all people, standing awkward and out of place in the waiting room doorway. Opal sets a small potted violet on the side table without a word, pats Joe's shoulder once, and settles into a chair like she means to stay a while. Your grandfather is a tough old bird, Opal says. Pulled me out of a snowbank back in '91 when nobody else would stop. Man's got more stubborn in him than the weather does. Joe manages a small, tired smile at that. The 2 farmers' brothers named Carl and Pete Sorensen hover near the doorway a moment before Carl finally speaks up. We heard about your fence, Carl says. Wanted you to know if you need extra hands mending it or watching the place at night, you just holler. Whole valley's had enough of Ashford's tricks. Been happening to more than just you, Pete adds quietly. Somebody let air out of my tractor tires last week. Never proved who did it, but I've got a good guess. Joe looks between them, something loosening in her chest at the realization she hasn't been carrying this fight quite as alone as she thought. Thank you, she says, truly. Danny Rourke stays near the doorway, hesitant, like he isn't sure he's welcome. I heard what happened, Danny says. Wanted to see if there was anything I could do. Joe studies him a moment, remembering him vaguely from the diner, the quiet one who hadn't laughed along. Why do you care? She asks, not unkindly, just honest. Danny shifts his weight, uncomfortable. Because what's happening to your family isn't right, he says, and I've stood by quiet too many times already. Joe doesn't say much back, but something in her eyes softens just slightly, the first small crack of hope in an otherwise terrible day. Even the diner's regular Thursday crowd feels the shift by early evening. A retired schoolteacher named Miss Alderson stops by the waiting room with a paperback novel and a thermos of tea, saying only that she remembered Joe bringing her tomatoes every August without fail and figured it was past time somebody brought her something back. Small gestures, most of them, but they stack up over the course of a long, frightening day, the way small kindnesses do when a town finally remembers how to be a town. Back at the diner that night after closing, Ruth sits at the counter with a notepad and a phone calling people she's known her whole life, one by one. Martha's boy can watch the Hargrove place overnight, she tells Opal over the phone. And the Petersons said they'd bring supper out for a week so Joe doesn't have to worry about cooking on top of everything else. You're turning into quite the general, Opal says, amusement in her voice despite the circumstances. Somebody's got to, Ruth says. That girl spent 13 years taking care of everybody else in this town one way or another, never once asked for a single thing back. Feels like it's past time we return the favor. She pulls her address book a little closer, flipping to a page worn soft from years of use, names and phone numbers crossed out and rewritten as neighbors moved, married, or passed on. There's history in that little book. Most of Millbrook's, if you look close enough. By the time Ruth finishes her calls, she's arranged for 6 different families to bring meals, 2 teenage boys from the church youth group to help mend the broken fence, and a standing offer from 3 different households for anyone to keep watch over the Hargrove property after dark. It isn't much in the grand scheme of things. Won't stop a land grab or a company as large as Ashford Holdings, but it's something. A town remembering slowly what it means to look after its own. Ruth hangs up the phone, looks at her list of names and feels something like hope for the first time in 3 long days. That evening, Sheriff Whitfield sits in his cruiser outside the hospital, staring at his phone. He's been digging quietly since yesterday's incident at the creek. Old habit of his, the kind that's kept this county mostly honest for over 2 decades. He pulled the county's original farm registry records, going back 13 years, looking for anything connected to the Hargrove name. What he found instead was a gap. A sealed record filed with the state referencing a formal request for parental consent regarding military enlistment dated the summer both Hargrove girls turned 18. Only one name remained active in any public record after that date: Josephine Hargrove. The other name, Eleanor, simply vanished from every local database Whitfield has access to, the way names sometimes do when someone's file gets moved somewhere far above a small county sheriff's clearance level. He'd tried calling an old contact at the state records office that afternoon, a woman named Diane he'd worked with on cases before. She'd gone quiet on the phone the moment he mentioned the name. "That file's flagged," Diane had told him, voice dropping low. "Federal hold. I can't even tell you what agency put it there, Dan. And honestly, I'd stop asking if I were you." "Why's that?" Whitfield had asked. "Because some doors," Diane said, "are locked for reasons that have nothing to do with you or me." He hadn't liked that answer. Still doesn't, sitting here in his cruiser with the engine idling. He thinks about calling his old friend at the FBI field office 2 states over, a man he'd worked a joint case with years back, then decides against it. Not yet. Not until he has something more solid than a gap in a database and a bad feeling in his gut. Instinct has carried him a long way in 22 years of wearing this badge. It's rarely steered him wrong. Whitfield sits with that for a long while, engine idling, watching moths circle the parking lot lights. He doesn't know exactly what it means yet, but 22 years of instinct tells him it means something that might matter a great deal before this week is through. Inside the hospital, past visiting hours, Jo sits alone beside her grandfather's bed, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, the most comforting sound she's heard all day. Walter stirs slightly, eyes fluttering open. "You should go home," he murmurs. "Get some rest. Not leaving you," Jo says simply. Walter studies her face in the dim light the same way he's studied it her whole life. "You called her yet?" he asks. "Your sister?" Jo hesitates. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because calling her makes this real," Jo admits quietly. "And I've been trying so hard to handle this myself." Walter reaches over, takes her hand in his, weak but warm. "Sweetheart," he says, "there's no shame in needing somebody. Strongest thing your grandmother ever did was let me carry half her burdens, same as she carried half of mine. That's not weakness, that's just love working the way it's supposed to." Jo blinks back tears she's been holding all day. "I don't want to scare her," she says. "She's got her own life now, her own work." "She'd want to know," Walter says. "Trust me on that." He pauses, gathering breath, the monitor beside him beeping steady through the quiet. "You know," he says, "I used to lie awake some nights back when you girls were small, wondering if I was doing right by either of you. 2 little ones left in the care of an old man who didn't have the first idea how to braid hair or bake a birthday cake." "You did fine, Grandpa," Jo says softly. "I did my best," Walter says. "Same as your mother and father would have wanted. But I never once wanted either of you to think you had to be strong all on your own. That's not what this family's about. Never has been." "I know," Jo says, though her voice catches on the words. "Do you?" Walter asks gently. "Because watching you this week carrying all of this, quiet and alone, I worry you forgot." Jo sits with that a long moment, watching the monitor's steady rhythm, feeling the weight of the whole week pressing down on her chest. "I just didn't want to be one more thing she had to worry about," Jo admits. "She's got a whole life out there, people depending on her, real dangers, not just an old land dispute in a town most maps barely bother naming." "This farm is her life too," Walter says. "Same as it's yours. Just because she chose a different way to protect it doesn't make her any less a part of it." Finally, she nods. "All right," she says. "All right, Grandpa. I'll call her tonight." Sheriff Whitfield stops by the hospital himself around 8 that evening, still in uniform, hat in hand, the way he was taught to carry it indoors. He finds Jo in the waiting room, the crowd of well-wishers having thinned out for the night. "How's you doing?" Whitfield asks, settling into the chair beside her. "Stable," Jo says. They're keeping him a few days to be sure. Whitfield nods slowly, turning his hat over in his hands. I'm sorry this happened, he says. All of it. The fence, the stress, your grandfather's heart. Man deserves better than this in his golden years. Thank you for coming, Joe says. I mean it when I say I'm looking into things, Whitfield says, lowering his voice slightly. The fence, the pressure from Ashford's company, all of it. I don't like what I'm finding, and I don't like how many doors seem to be closing the harder I push. Joe studies him carefully. What kind of doors? Whitfield hesitates, choosing his words with care.
Records that shouldn't be sealed for a small county matter, he says. Names that used to be public, quietly disappearing from files I've had access to for 20 years. I don't know what it means yet, but something bigger than a land dispute is sitting underneath all this.
Jo's expression doesn't change, though something flickers behind her eyes, quick and careful. You'll let me know if you find anything, she asks. First thing, Whitfield promises. You've got my word on that. He stands, settling his hat back on his head, pausing at the doorway. Whatever's coming Friday, he says, you're not facing it alone. This whole town's watching now. That's got to count for something. He leaves Jo sitting there, turning his words over in her mind, wondering just how much longer she can keep the truth folded up, quiet inside her. Same as that handkerchief in her pocket. Across town, Trent sits alone in his dorm room back home for the summer, scrolling through his phone when he sees a post from a local Millbrook community page. Prayers for Walter Hargrove, it reads, a photo of the old farmer attached, taken years back at some county fair, grinning wide beside a blue ribbon pumpkin. Trent stares at the post a long moment, thinking about bolt cutters and a cracked wire fence, about cattle scattering in a panic toward a busy county road. He tells himself it isn't connected. Tells himself a heart attack in a man that age could happen any day for any reason. He almost believes it. He sets the phone down, face down on his desk, and doesn't pick it back up again for a long while. That same night, unable to sleep, Cole drives out past the edge of town, past the turnoff toward the Hargrove farm, without really deciding to. He parks on the shoulder of the county road, engine off, and stares out at the dark fields stretching toward the farmhouse in the distance. One window, still lit gold against the night. The hospital, having sent Jo home for a few hours to rest before returning at dawn. He thinks about his father's voice in that study. Mercy rarely feels like mercy in the moment. He thinks about Danny's words in the car outside the theater. Maybe it's time you learn to say no. He thinks about a girl kneeling in the mud outside a diner, gathering up her mother's handkerchief without a single word of complaint, looking at him afterward with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity either. Something closer to disappointment in a boy who could have been better than this. Cole doesn't know what to do with any of it. Doesn't know how to be the son his father wants and still look at himself in the mirror come morning. He sits there a long while, engine off, watching that single lit window until it finally goes dark, and then he drives home slow, the weight of the whole week sitting heavier on him than he's willing to admit out loud to anyone. 9 o'clock finds Jo standing alone in the hospital parking lot, phone pressed to her ear, the cool night air doing little to calm the storm still churning inside her. The call connects on the first ring this time. Jo? What's wrong? The voice on the other end is instantly alert, all business, the way it gets when something in Jo's tone gives her away before she says a single word. It's Grandpa, Jo says, voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. He had a heart attack. He's stable, but what? But this isn't just stress from getting older, Jo says. Somebody cut our fence yesterday, scared the cattle loose on purpose, and the letter, the land grab, the sheriff finding cut wires, none of this is an accident anymore. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that means someone is thinking fast, calculating, shifting entirely into a different gear. Tell me everything, the voice says. From the beginning, don't leave anything out. Jo does, standing there in the dark parking lot, laying out 3 days of pressure and fear in a voice that finally allows itself to shake. She tells her about the letter, about the 72-hour deadline, about the fence cut clean through in 3 places, about the heifer's wounded legs, about the black sedan idling on the county road that sped away the second she came into view. She tells her about Grandpa collapsing in the kitchen, about the 12 longest minutes of her life waiting for the ambulance, about a heart monitor she still can't stop hearing, even now, hours later, standing under fluorescent parking lot lights. When she finishes, there's a long pause on the other end. "I should have come home the second that letter arrived," the voice says, low and tight with something that sounds almost like guilt. "You couldn't have known it would get this bad," Joe says. "I should have known anyway," the voice answers. "That's the job, knowing before it gets this bad." "What do we do?" Joe asks. Another pause. When the voice speaks again, it's different, steadier, sharper. Something's settling into place like armor. "You keep Grandpa safe and calm," the voice says. "You let the sheriff keep digging quietly, and you hold on 2 more days, however hard that is." "And then what?" "And then," the voice says, "it's time I came home." Joe closes her eyes, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in 3 days. Not relief, exactly. Something closer to hope. "How soon?" she asks. "Soon as I can get there," the voice says. "Sooner than you think." "Nell," Joe says quietly, using the name only family ever uses. "Be careful. Whatever you're planning." "Careful's my whole job, little sister," Nell says, the ghost of a smile audible even through the phone. "Well, careful and 1 or 2 other things." "I mean it," Joe says. "So do I," Nell answers. "Go be with Grandpa. Tell him I love him. Tell him I'm coming home." The line goes quiet. Joe stands there a long moment after phone still pressed to her ear, listening to nothing at all, feeling steadier than she has in days. 2 hours later, on a dark stretch of interstate 2 states away, a black sedan pulls off the highway and into a gas station, headlights cutting bright against the night. The woman who steps out to fill the tank is dressed plain. Jeans, a gray jacket, hair pulled back tight and practical. Nothing about her stands out. That's exactly the point. She checks her phone once, reads a short message, then climbs back behind the wheel without wasting a single motion. Millbrook, Iowa. Still the better part of a day's drive away, but closer with every passing mile. She pulls back onto the highway, driving steady through the dark, thinking about a farm she hasn't seen in over a year. An old man whose heart just reminded everyone how fragile a lifetime of hard work can leave a person, and a sister who has spent 13 years quietly holding an entire family together on her own. Eleanor thinks about the choice she made at 18, standing in that driveway, watching Joe decide to stay behind. She'd told herself for years that she'd made the harder choice, going off to serve, while Joe stayed safe at home, tending crops and cattle. Driving through the dark tonight, she isn't so sure that was ever true. She remembers something from childhood, an image that surfaces unbidden as the highway miles slide past. Both of them may be 7 years old, standing at the edge of the north pasture during a summer storm, holding hands, while lightning split the sky over Millbrook. "You're not scared?" young Joe had asked her that night, voice small against the thunder. "Course I am," young Eleanor had answered. "But you're right here. Can't be too scared with you right here." 13 years and 1,000 miles later, Eleanor wonders if her sister has had anyone standing beside her through this particular storm. Wonders if quiet, steady Joe has ever once let herself lean on somebody the way she always let Joe lean on her back when they were small enough to still believe holding hands could keep the lightning away. Staying is its own kind of hard. Staying means watching people you love grow old, and frail means burying parents young, and then spending every single day afterward making sure nobody else gets buried too soon. Staying means facing down men like Richard Ashford without a weapon in hand, without a unit backing you up, with nothing but stubbornness and love and a farmhouse full of memories to defend. Eleanor grips the wheel a little tighter, watching the white lines blur past in her headlights. Whatever training she has, whatever skills the years have sharpened in her, none of it changes one simple fact, settling heavy in her chest tonight. Her sister has been fighting a war of her own this whole time, quiet and unseen. And she's been fighting it entirely alone. That ends tomorrow. She thinks about all the birthdays she's missed, the harvests she's only heard about secondhand over crackling phone connections from places she still can't name out loud. She thinks about how easy it's been these past 13 years to tell herself the farm was in good hands, that Joe had everything under control, that her own absence was simply the cost of a different kind of service. Maybe it was. Maybe some costs are worth paying, but sitting behind this wheel tonight, watching the dark miles of Nebraska and then Iowa unspool ahead of her, Eleanor Hargrove finds herself wondering if she let that truth become an excuse for staying away longer than she ever needed to. Not me more. Whatever else this week brings, she isn't running from this fight, and she isn't going to let her sister face the rest of it standing alone. Eleanor Hargrove sets her jaw, checks her mirrors, and drives faster into the night. Whatever is happening back home, it's about to meet something it was never prepared for. The gas station fades in her rearview mirror, one more small town swallowed by the dark behind her. And ahead of her, nothing but highway and the long, steady work of getting home in time. Friday morning comes to Millbrook heavy with heat, the kind of stillness that sits over a town right before something breaks. Joe wakes before dawn, same as always, though she barely slept at all. She spent the last 2 nights on a cot beside Walter's hospital bed, coming home only long enough to shower and feed the animals. The nurses have gotten used to her by now, bringing an extra blanket without being asked, letting her stay past visiting hours without argument. Small kindnesses that mean more than they probably realize. Today is different. Today, the 72 hours finally run out. The council meets at 6 o'clock this evening. Whatever happens in that room decides the fate of every farm left standing in this valley. Joe drives to the hospital first, sits with Walter through breakfast, watches him eat, a little more than yesterday, color slowly returning to his face. The doctors have said his heart is stabilizing, though they've warned it will take weeks of rest and careful monitoring before he's fully back to himself. For now, small victories matter most. A full breakfast, a steadier voice, a little more color in his cheeks than the day before. "You look tired," Walter says, studying her over his oatmeal. "I'm fine," Joe says. "You keep saying that," Walter says. "Doesn't make it true." Joe manages a small smile. "Nell's on her way," she says. "Should be here sometime today." Something shifts in Walter's expression, relief and something else beneath it. An old worry resurfacing after 13 years of staying buried. "You told her everything?" he asks. "Everything," Joe says. Walter nods slowly, looking out the window at the parking lot below, at a world that's about to get a great deal more complicated. "Then I suppose it's time," he says quietly. Past time, if I'm honest with myself. He's quiet a moment, watching a hospital cart rattle past in the hallway outside before speaking again. "You know, I always figured this day would come, eventually," Walter says. "Just didn't figure it would take a heart attack and a land grab to bring it around." "Nobody plans for a week like this one, Grandpa," Joe says. "No," Walter agrees. "But I suppose that's when a family finds out what it's really made of." He reaches for her hand across the little rolling table, careful of the tube still taped to his arm. "Whatever happens tonight," he says, "you remember something for me. This family's never once needed to win by being the loudest voice in the room. We just need to still be standing when the shouting finally stops." Joe squeezes his hand back, holding on to those words a little tighter than she lets on. A nurse pokes her head in to check his vitals, jotting numbers on a chart with the easy efficiency of someone who's done this 1,000 times before. She smiles at Joe on her way out, the kind of small, knowing smile reserved for family who've practically moved into the ward this week. "Big day," the nurse says. "Something like that," Joe answers, managing a tired laugh despite everything weighing on her. Joe leaves the hospital around 10, driving back toward Millbrook with the radio off, same as always, her mind working through everything that still needs doing before 6 o'clock. She doesn't make it back to the farm. A Millbrook police cruiser pulls her over 2 miles outside town, lights flashing behind her in the rearview mirror.
Joe's stomach tightens immediately. She checks her speed, checks her mirrors, nothing out of order.
She pulls onto the shoulder, confused. She hasn't broken a single traffic law, hasn't done anything worth this kind of attention. The deputy who approaches isn't Whitfield, it's a younger officer named Deputy Reeves, someone Joe barely knows, someone who started on the force only 8 months ago. He looks nervous, hand resting a little too carefully near his belt, the way new officers do when they're not entirely comfortable with an assignment. Josephine Hargrove Reeves asks. "That's me," Joe says. "Is something wrong, officer?" "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Reeves says. "You're being brought in for questioning." "Questioning about what?" "Assault complaint," Reeves says. "Filed this morning. Cole Ashford says you threatened him with a weapon 2 nights ago outside the Fairview movie theater." Joe stares at him, genuinely stunned for the first time in days. "That's not true," she says. "I haven't been anywhere near Cole Ashford in 3 days. I've been at the hospital with my grandfather."
"That's what we're going to sort out down at the station," Reeves says, not unkindly but firm.
"Step out of the vehicle, please, ma'am." Joe does, hands raised, slightly calm, even now, though something cold is settling deep in her stomach. She knows exactly what this is. A convenient accusation timed perfectly to keep her occupied and discredited right before the most important meeting of her family's life.
She doesn't fight it, doesn't argue, just lets Reeves cuff her hands in front of her.
Gentle as he can manage, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation himself. "I'm sorry about this," Reeves mutters as he helps her into the back of the cruiser. "Orders came down from pretty high up. I don't have much say in it." "I understand," Joe says quietly.
"You're just doing your job." But inside, her mind is racing now, counting hours instead of days. 6 o'clock is closer than it's ever felt.
At the station, Joe sits alone in a small interview room, wrists finally uncuffed, hands folded on the table in front of her. Through the door she can hear raised voices, Whitfield's voice sharp and unhappy.
"This complaint doesn't hold water," Reeves Whitfield says. "Cole Ashford filed it this morning, conveniently the same day as the council vote. You don't see a problem with that timing?"
"I just process what comes across my desk, Sheriff," Reeves says. "Complaint's legitimate on paper, witness statement and everything."
"Whose witness statement?"
"Kid named Trent Marsh," Reeves says.
"Says he saw the whole thing." Whitfield's voice drops lower, harder to hear. Joe strains to catch the words anyway. "Trent Marsh," Whitfield mutters. "That's the same name that keeps showing up everywhere lately. Curious coincidence, don't you think?"
"Sheriff, I just need you to sign off on the holding paperwork," Reeves says. "Chief's orders."
"Chief's orders," Whitfield repeats, disgust plain in his voice. "Chief takes his orders from Richard Ashford's checkbook these days, and everybody in this department knows it." The conversation goes quiet after that.
A moment later, the door opens and Whitfield steps inside, closing it behind him. "I'm sorry about this," he says, sitting across from Joe. "I want you to know I don't believe a word of this complaint."
"I know," Joe says. "Problem is," Whitfield continues, "the paperwork's already been filed. Chief's ordered you held pending review, which conveniently means you're stuck here until after 6 o'clock tonight, whether the complaint holds up or not."
Joe's jaw tightens. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Keep me out of that meeting."
"Looks that way," Whitfield admits. "I'm trying to find a way around it, but my hands are tied more than I'd like to admit."
"What about the diner footage?" Joe asks. "From 2 nights ago. That would prove I wasn't anywhere near that theater." Whitfield's expression darkens. "Already checked," he says. "Ruth's security system logged a malfunction that same night. Whole file's corrupted."
Convenient, considering everything else happening this week.
Joe closes her eyes a moment, feeling the walls closing in around her, quite literally.
"There's got to be something,"
she says. "Phone records, my truck's mileage, anything." "I've already requested your cell tower data," Whitfield says. "Might take a few hours to come through, which puts us cutting it awfully close to 6 o'clock.
"A few hours I don't have," Joe says quietly.
"I know," Whitfield says, frustration plain in his voice. "Believe me, I know exactly what's riding on tonight. I just need you to trust me a little longer." "I do trust you," Joe says. "I'm just running out of time to trust anyone." Whitfield reaches across the table, an unexpected gesture, and squeezes her folded hands once, brief and firm. He stands hesitating at the door. "For what it's worth," he says, "whatever's coming for you, Josephine Hargrove, I don't think it's going to work the way Richard Ashford thinks it will." He leaves her alone with that thought, the door locking softly behind him. Word travels fast through Millbrook, same as it always does. By noon, half the town has heard that Joe Hargrove was arrested on an assault complaint filed by Cole Ashford. The story spreads in different shapes the way stories always do. Some people believing it outright, others smelling something rotten underneath. At the diner, Ruth stands behind the counter, arms crossed, refusing to serve a table of Ashford employees who stop in for lunch. "We're closed," she tells them flatly, though the sign in the window says otherwise. "Ma'am, we're just looking for lunch," one of them says. "Not here you're not," Ruth says. "Not today." They leave grumbling, and Ruth locks the door behind them, hanging a handwritten sign that simply reads, "Closed in solidarity." Opal sits at her usual booth watching the whole exchange with quiet approval. "Didn't know you had that in you," Opal says. "Neither did I," Ruth admits. "Guess I finally got tired of being scared." Across town at the Sorensen farm, Carl and Pete load up their truck with folding chairs and a hand-painted sign reading "Justice for Joe," planning to be first in line at tonight's council meeting. The two teenage boys from the church youth group, still out mending the Hargrove fence line, hear the news on their phones and finish the job twice as fast, determined not to leave a single strand of wire loose before evening. Small as these gestures are, they add up to something larger. A town remembering, piece by piece, what it means to stand up for one of its own. Even Councilwoman Patricia Voss, sitting alone in her kitchen that afternoon, finds herself staring at the folder of paperwork Richard Ashford had shown her at dinner 2 nights before. Something uneasy churning in her stomach that has nothing to do with the coffee she's drinking. She thinks about Joe Hargrove, a young woman she's watched deliver produce to that diner every week for years now, sitting in a jail cell over an accusation that arrived suspiciously well-timed. She doesn't know yet what she'll do about it, but something in her has already started shifting the way conscience sometimes does, slow and quiet until it isn't quiet anymore. She picks up her phone twice that afternoon, meaning to call Richard and ask him directly what he knows about the timing of this complaint. Both times, she sets it back down without dialing. By the third time, her hand doesn't shake nearly as much. Cole hears about the arrest that afternoon, sitting in his father's study, feeling sicker with every passing minute. "You filed a complaint?" Cole says, staring at his father. "Against Joe Hargrove, for something that never happened." "I filed nothing," Richard says smoothly. "Trent filed it, of his own accord." "Trent doesn't do anything of his own accord," Cole snaps. "You told him to do it, same as you told him to cut that fence." Richard's expression hardens. "Watch your tone, son." "No," Cole says, something breaking loose in his chest that's been building for days. "You watch what you're doing. That girl's grandfather is in the hospital because of us, and now she's sitting in a jail cell because you needed her out of the way for one evening." "I need this deal closed," Richard says, voice rising now too. "Do you have any idea what's riding on Friday's vote? Investors' contracts, 400 jobs for this county." "None of that matters if it's built on lying and framing an innocent woman," Cole says. "Everything in business is built on somebody's disadvantage," Richard says. "That's simply how the world works, whether you like hearing it or not." "Then maybe the world needs to work differently," Cole says. "Maybe I want to be someone who makes it work differently." Richard stares at him like he's speaking a foreign language. Richard stands, circling the desk, getting close enough that Cole can see the anger flashing hot behind his father's eyes. "You'll understand someday," Richard says. "Business requires sacrifice, requires people willing to do what's necessary, even when it's uncomfortable." "This isn't uncomfortable," Cole says, voice shaking now. "This is wrong, and I'm done pretending it isn't." He turns and walks out of the study, out of the house, out to his car, driving nowhere in particular, just needing to be anywhere his father isn't. Behind him, Richard stands alone in his study, jaw tight, telling himself his son will come around, eventually. He has no idea how wrong he's about to be proven, on more than one count, before this night is through. Back at the sheriff's station, Whitfield sits at his desk that afternoon, staring at an old external hard drive he hasn't touched in years. The clock on the wall ticking louder than it has any right to. An idea has been nagging at him since Ruth mentioned her security footage going corrupted. Ruth's system, he happens to know, backs up automatically to a secondary cloud server the diner's internet provider set up 2 years back, a detail most people, including whoever tampered with the local footage, likely never knew existed. He remembers helping Ruth set up that account himself, actually, back when she'd complained about her old system crashing during a bad storm. Small-town connections, the kind that come back around when you least expect them to matter. He calls Ruth directly. "You still got that account information from when they installed your security system?" he asks. "Should be somewhere," Ruth says. "Why?" "Because I don't think whoever wiped your local footage knew about the backup server," Whitfield says. "Get me that login information, Ruth. Fast as you can." Ruth finds the paperwork in a kitchen drawer within minutes, reading the account details over the phone, with hands that shake slightly from hope more than nerves. 20 minutes later, sitting in Ruth's back office with her laptop open in front of him, Whitfield finds exactly what he's hoping for. A backup file, untouched, time-stamped from 2 nights ago. The footage shows the diner's parking lot camera angled toward the street, and clearly, unmistakably time-stamped at the exact hour Cole claims Joe threatened him at the movie theater 2 towns over. It shows Joe's truck parked outside the hospital in Fairview, nowhere near Millbrook at all, backed up by a second angle showing her walking inside the hospital entrance at that very same timestamp. Whitfield sits back, exhaling slow. "Got you," he mutters. He copies the file immediately, backs it up twice more for safety, and heads straight for the station holding cells, hope rising in his chest for the first time all day. At 5:30 that evening, with barely enough time to spare, Whitfield unlocks the door to Joe's holding cell himself. "Complaint's been dropped," he says. "Turns out you've got a rock-solid alibi, time-stamped and everything. Cole Ashford's accusation just fell apart in my hands." Joe stands quickly, relief washing over her. "The council meeting," she says. "What time is it?" 25 minutes till 6, Whitfield says. "I've got my cruiser out front. We can make it if we hurry." They run for the car together, Joe still in yesterday's clothes, hair coming loose from its braid, driven by nothing but sheer determination now. As they pull out of the station lot, Whitfield glances over at her. "There's something else you should know," he says. "While you were locked up, I got a call. Federal number, no name given. Said someone would be arriving at the council meeting tonight, and that I should make sure you're there to see it." Joe's breath catches. "Nell?" she whispers. "Your sister, I presume?" Whitfield says, eyes on the road, foot heavy on the gas. "She's here?" Joe says, something between fear and hope blooming in her chest. "She's actually here." Whitfield doesn't ask any more questions, just drives faster, lights flashing, racing the clock toward Millbrook Town Hall. The council chamber is packed by the time Whitfield's cruiser screeches to a stop outside. Every folding chair the Sorensen brothers brought is full. Farmers line the back wall, arms crossed. Ruth stands near the front, Opal beside her. Danny Rourke sits near the aisle, uncomfortable in a room full of people he barely knows, but present all the same. The old wooden chamber, usually half empty for these meetings, hums now with more bodies than the fire code probably allows, folding chairs crammed into every available space, people standing 3 deep along the back wall. Richard Ashford sits near the front, composed, confident, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. Cole sits several rows back, apart from his father, face pale and tense, hands twisting together in his lap. Councilwoman Patricia Voss calls the meeting to order at exactly 6 o'clock, voice slightly unsteady. "We're here to vote on the Millbrook Economic Development Initiative," she begins, "specifically the blight designation for the northern agricultural parcels." Richard rises smoothly when given the floor, launching into a polished presentation about jobs, tourism, progress. Slides flash on a screen behind him. Numbers, projections, promises delivered with the practiced confidence of a man who has given this exact speech a dozen times before in a dozen other towns. Jo slips into the chamber just as he finishes, Whitfield close behind, her breathless from the run in from the parking lot. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Heads turn. "There she is," someone whispers. "Thought she was locked up." Richard's composure flickers for just a fraction of a second before he recovers it. "As I was saying," he continues smoothly, "this project represents the single greatest economic opportunity this valley has seen in a generation." Patricia clears her throat. "Are there any public comments before we proceed to a vote?" Jo stands, walking toward the podium, exhausted, disheveled, and entirely unafraid. "I have something to say," she says. She hasn't finished 3 sentences before the back doors of the council chamber swing open. Every head in the room turns. A woman walks in, dressed plain but purposeful, hair pulled back tight, moving with the kind of controlled economy of motion that fills a room without a single word spoken. 2 men in dark suits flank her, one carrying a slim black case. For one long moment, the whole chamber falls completely silent. Jo turns, and something in her chest breaks open at the sight of her sister's face for the first time in over a year. "Now," she breathes. Eleanor Hargrove walks straight down the center aisle, stops beside her twin sister, and turns to face the stunned council. "My apologies for the interruption," she says, voice calm, clear, carrying easily through the silent room. "My name is Eleanor Hargrove. Some of you may remember me. Most of you probably assumed I went off to college 13 years ago and simply never came back." Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Opal, in the front row, allows herself the smallest, satisfied nod, leaning toward Ruth to whisper something that sounds a great deal like, "I told you so." "I didn't go to college," Eleanor continues. "I enlisted in the United States Army the summer I turned 18 alongside my sister, who ultimately chose to stay behind and keep this family's farm alive. I spent the years since serving my country in ways I'm not permitted to discuss in detail, most recently as a civilian security consultant, working alongside federal agencies on matters of land fraud and financial crimes targeting rural communities." She lets that settle over the room a moment, watching faces shift from confusion to understanding before continuing. "I want to be clear about something," Eleanor says. "My sister isn't the story here tonight, though I know curiosity about our family has been simmering in this town for years. The story here is what's been happening to families across this valley, and the man responsible for it." She nods toward the man beside her holding the black case. "This is Agent Marcus Doyle from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Rural Fraud Task Force," Eleanor says. "We've been building a case against Ashford Land Holdings for the past 4 months, following a pattern of coercive land acquisition across 3 counties. Richard Ashford rises abruptly, face draining of color.
"This is outrageous," he says. "I don't know what this woman thinks she's doing, but I've broken no laws."
"Haven't you?" Agent Doyle says calmly, stepping forward. He opens the black case, produces a folder, hands copies to the council members seated at the front table. "We have documented evidence of falsified property tax assessments used to pressure at least 11 families into selling below market value. We have witness testimony regarding intimidation tactics, including property damage designed to look accidental." He glances at Jo. "Including a cut fence line resulting in injured livestock and, indirectly, a cardiac event suffered by Walter Hargrove just yesterday morning." The room erupts into murmurs. Ruth grips Opal's hand tight. Danny Rourke sits forward in his seat watching Cole across the room, whose face has gone entirely white. "And," Eleanor adds, voice hardening slightly, "we have this." She takes a small device from her pocket, connects it to the chamber's audio system with practiced efficiency, and presses play. Richard Ashford's voice fills the room, unmistakably, recorded from inside his own study 3 days prior. "You know how many families I've bought out in this county over the years. This is a mercy, son, whether the Hargroves can see that yet or not." followed immediately by Cole's voice, tight and uncertain. Doesn't feel like mercy. The recording plays for nearly a full minute, capturing conversation after conversation about pressure tactics, falsified assessments, and offense deliberately cut to cause panic and injury. By the time it ends, the chamber sits in stunned, absolute silence. Richard Ashford stands frozen at the front of the room. Lawyers on either side of him whispering urgently, faces grim. "Where did you get that recording?" Richard demands, voice cracking with something between fury and panic. "Your son gave it to us," Eleanor says simply. Every head in the room turns toward Cole, sitting several rows back, hands trembling slightly in his lap. Cole stands, slowly forcing himself to meet his father's furious gaze. "I recorded it 2 nights ago," Cole says, voice unsteady but growing stronger with each word. "After the fence. After I found out about Walter's heart attack. I couldn't sleep. I sat outside the Hargrove farm most of that night just thinking." He looks at his father, something breaking loose in his expression, grief and anger tangled together. "You've spent my whole life telling me business requires sacrifice," Cole says. "That mercy doesn't feel like mercy in the moment. But watching an old man nearly die because we cut his fence for a real estate deal, that's not sacrifice, Dad. That's just cruelty wearing a suit." Richard stares at his son, genuinely speechless for what might be the first time in his adult life. "I called Agent Doyle's office myself yesterday morning," Cole continues. "Told them everything. Gave them the recording. I don't expect anyone in this room to forgive me for what I've already done, but I wasn't going to let it keep happening." He turns toward Joe, standing near the podium, tears finally spilling down his face. "I'm sorry," he says, voice breaking completely now. "For the diner, for the handkerchief, for all of it. I don't have any excuse that makes it right." The chamber sits silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Joe studies him a long moment, exhaustion and old anger and something unexpectedly close to compassion, all warring behind her eyes. "I know," she says finally, quietly. "I saw it in your face that day, Cole. The chance to take it back. I'm glad you finally took it." Councilwoman Patricia Voss calls for order, though her voice shakes as she does it. "Given the evidence presented tonight," she says, "I move that we table the blight designation vote indefinitely, pending full investigation by federal authorities." She pauses, looking out over the packed chamber at faces she's known her whole life. Farmers whose families have worked this valley for generations. "I want to say for the record," she continues, voice steadying, "that I should have asked harder questions weeks ago when this whole initiative first crossed my desk. I let convenience and pressure quiet instincts I should have trusted. That won't happen again. Not on my watch." Councilman Buford, pale and sweating, seconds the motion without hesitation, suddenly eager to distance himself from a scandal about to consume the entire county. The vote passes unanimously. 5 votes cast in quick succession, each council member visibly relieved to have the decision behind them. A ripple of applause breaks out across the chamber, farmers rising to their feet, Ruth wiping tears openly, Opal clapping slow and satisfied from her seat near the front. Agent Doyle steps forward, addressing Richard Ashford directly. "Mr. Ashford, I'm going to need you to come with us for further questioning," he says. "You have the right to remain silent." The chamber watches in stunned silence as Richard Ashford, county's wealthiest and most powerful man, is escorted out through the same doors he walked through in total confidence less than an hour before. Cole watches his father go, tears still streaming, something like grief and relief tangled together on his face. Outside the town hall, afterward, the summer evening is cooled just slightly, stars beginning to prick through the darkening sky. Joe and Eleanor stand together near the sheriff's cruiser, twin faces finally reunited after 13 long years apart, though the years show differently on each of them. Eleanor's hands bear a different kind of calluses than Joe's earned in different soil under a different kind of sun. "You look tired," Eleanor says, echoing Walter's words from that morning. "I am tired," Joe admits, managing a real smile for the first time in days. But it's over. Not entirely, Eleanor says. There's still an investigation to finish. Still Grandpa's recovery. Still 11 other families to help make right. But the worst part's over, Joe says. Eleanor pulls her sister into a hug tight enough to hurt the way she used to when they were small. I should have come home sooner, Eleanor murmurs. I'm sorry I let you carry all of this alone. You came when it mattered most, Joe says. That's what counts. They stand there a long moment holding on to each other, 13 years of distance closing in an instant. You know, Eleanor says finally, pulling back slightly, studying her sister's face in the streetlight, I used to think I made the harder choice. Leaving, serving, all of it. You did make the harder choice, Joe says. No, Eleanor says, shaking her head slowly. I ran towards something loud and dangerous because it was easier than staying and watching Grandpa grow old one slow day at a time. You stayed and did the quiet, unglamorous work of holding a family together for 13 straight years. That's not the easier path, Joe. Never was. Joe doesn't quite know what to say to that. She just squeezes her sister's hand instead, the two of them standing together under a sky full of stars, saying everything that matters without needing many more words at all. Come on, Joe says finally. Grandpa's waiting to hear how it went. He made me promise to call the second the vote was finished. Then let's not keep him waiting, Eleanor says. They drive together to the hospital that same night, arriving just past visiting hours, though the same understanding nurses waved them through without argument, having grown fond of this family over the past several days. Walter is sitting up in bed when they arrive, television murmuring low in the corner, worry etched plain across his weathered face, until he sees both of his granddaughters walk through the door together. Well, he says, voice thick with emotion, would you look at that? Vote's tabled, Joe says. Ashford's under arrest. It's over, Grandpa. Walter looks between the two of them, tears gathering in his eyes that he doesn't bother hiding. Both my girls, he says softly, standing right here together. Never thought I'd see this day. Eleanor crosses the room and takes his hand, careful of the monitor wires still attached to his arm. I'm sorry it took so long to come home, she says. You came exactly when you were needed, Walter says. That's all that ever mattered. The three of them stay together long past visiting hours, that night nurses quietly looking the other way. 3 generations of one stubborn, loving family, finally breathing easy for the first time in a very long week. Danny Rourke approaches Cole outside the town hall, finding him sitting alone on the concrete steps, head in his hands. That took guts, Danny says. What you did in there. Doesn't undo anything, Cole says, voice hollow. No, Danny agrees, but it's a start. Cole looks up at him, eyes red-rimmed. What happens now? He asks. To me, I mean. My dad's under investigation, might lose everything, and I'm the one who handed them the evidence. I don't know, Danny says honestly. But I know Joe Hargrove, just now standing right in front of you, forgave you before you even finished apologizing. That's gotta count for something going forward. Cole looks toward Joe and Eleanor still embracing near the cruiser and feels something shift inside him. Not absolution, exactly, something closer to the first small step toward it. He sits there a while longer after Danny leaves, watching the crowd slowly thin out around the town hall steps, the reality of everything that just happened settling over him in waves. His father, led away in handcuffs, his own voice shaking but steady, filling that silent chamber. A stranger's forgiveness offered before he even finished asking for it. He doesn't know what comes next, but for the first time in longer than he can remember, he isn't dreading finding out. A week later, the Hargrove farmhouse porch fills with more people than it's seen in years. Walter sits in a wheelchair, for now, doctor's orders, though his color has returned and his voice carries as strong as ever. Duke lies at his feet, tail thumping steady against the wooden boards, refusing to leave the old man's side for more than a few minutes at a time. Ruth arrives with a casserole, Opal brings a pie, still warm from the oven, insisting 3 separate times that the recipe isn't nearly as good as her mother's used to be. The Sorensen brothers show up with a truckload of lumber to help repair what's left of the damaged fence, joined by half a dozen other farmers from the valley, men who spent the whole week hearing the full story and deciding they wanted to lend a hand however they could.
Sheriff Whitfield stops by in civilian clothes for once, sitting on the porch steps with a glass of lemonade, looking more relaxed than anyone's seen him in weeks. Somebody's put a small radio on the porch railing, playing a country station, low enough for background music, loud enough to fill the quiet gaps in conversation. It's the kind of small, ordinary detail that makes a gathering feel like a celebration instead of just a repair crew showing up to fix a fence.
Ashford's cooperating with federal prosecutors, he tells Walter, trying to cut a deal. Looks like most of those 11 families are going to get their settlements renegotiated fair, or their land returned outright where possible. That's good news, Walter says. Best news I've had in years, Whitfield agrees. Council's already talking about tightening up conflict of interest rules for future development votes, too. Patricia Voss pushed that through herself first thing Monday morning. Guess this whole mess did some good after all, Walter says. Took some doing to get there, Whitfield says, but I suppose most good things do. He goes on to explain that Richard Ashford faces charges ranging from fraud to witness tampering, likely years of legal proceedings ahead of him, regardless of how any plea deal shakes out. Trent Marsh, facing lesser charges for his role in both the fence and the false complaint, has agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a chance at probation instead of prison time, a chance he seems determined not to waste, having already reached out privately to apologize to Joe through his attorney. Deputy Reeves, for his part, was quietly reassigned to a different department after the incident, the chief himself facing scrutiny for how quickly he'd moved on Cole's unfounded complaint. Eleanor moves through the crowd easily, helping Ruth set up folding tables, laughing at something Opal says, looking more at home on this porch than she has anywhere else in over a decade. Opal catches Joe's eye at one point during the afternoon, waving her over to the porch railing where she's been sitting most of the day, watching the gathering with quiet satisfaction. "Told you there was more to that story than either of us knew," Opal says, nodding toward Eleanor across the yard. "You did," Joe admits, "though I suppose you never expected it to unfold quite this way." "Old women rarely expect anything," Opal says. "We just watch and wait and trust that most stories find their way to a fair ending eventually, if given enough time and enough good people willing to stand up along the way." She pats Joe's hand once, the same gesture she's given Ruth countless times over the years, and turns her attention back to the yard full of neighbors sharing plates of food and quiet conversation. As the afternoon stretches into a golden evening, someone brings out a folding table loaded with pies and casseroles, and the whole gathering settles into an easy, unhurried supper together, plates balanced on knees, laughter carrying across the yard in a way the farm hasn't heard in years. Joe watches her sister from the porch steps. A small, quiet moment where 13 years of separation finally feels like it's healing rather than hurting. Cole arrives near the end of the afternoon, hesitant, uncertain of his welcome. He's traded his usual polished appearance for work clothes, sleeves rolled up, ready to help however he can. His father's estate sits mostly empty now, the man himself out on bail, awaiting trial, and Cole has been staying in a small apartment above the hardware store, working odd jobs to keep himself afloat while the family's assets remain frozen pending investigation. "I came to help with the fence," he says quietly to no one in particular. Walter studies him a long moment from his wheelchair, the way he studies most things, patient and thorough. Conversations quiet slightly around the porch. A few of the farmers exchange glances, unsure how this moment will land. "Grab a hammer, son," Walter says finally. "Plenty of work still needs doing." Cole nods, relief and gratitude plain on his face, and joins the other men working the fence line as the afternoon stretches golden toward evening. Danny works alongside him most of the afternoon, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm neither expected, hammering posts and stringing wire under a sun that's finally starting to feel like summer again instead of a countdown clock.
Didn't think you'd actually show up, Danny says, wiping sweat from his brow. Didn't think I'd actually be welcome, Cole admits. Guess that's the thing about people around here, Danny says. Slower to forgive than city folks maybe, but once they do, they mean it, all the way through. Cole nods slowly, driving another post into the ground, feeling something like belonging for the first time in longer than he can remember. That evening, as the crowd finally begins to thin, Jo finds a quiet moment alone with her grandfather on the porch. She reaches into her pocket and pulls out her mother's handkerchief, worn soft from years of careful handling, and sets it gently on the small table beside Walter's chair next to the old metal patch Eleanor brought inside from the car. Feels right, having both of them out here together, Jo says. Walter picks up the patch, turning it slowly in his weathered fingers, then reaches for the handkerchief with his other hand. You know, I never told a soul what unit that patch belonged to, Walter says quietly. Not even after she made it into Delta Force, back when hardly any woman got that chance at all. Told everyone in town she worked a desk job for the government. Seemed safer that way for her and for us. I always wondered how much of it you knew, Jo says. I knew all of it, Walter says. Every year, every posting, every quiet phone call in the middle of the night telling me she was all right. Just never saw the sense in telling this whole town something that wasn't mine to tell. Your mother stitched this the winter before she passed. Walter continues nodding to the handkerchief now in Jo's hands. Sat right here on this porch, working the needle by lamplight most evenings, said every stitch was a little prayer for you girls. Jo takes the handkerchief back, gently running her thumb along the worn, embroidered letter. I never knew that, she says. There's a lot you were too young to know back then, Walter says. A lot I probably should have told you both over the years instead of locking pieces of it away in a cedar chest. You did right by us, Grandpa, Jo says. Whatever you kept quiet, whatever you locked away, we turned out all right. Your mother would be proud of both of you, he says quietly, whichever path each of you chose. I used to wonder if I made the wrong choice, Jo admits, staying behind while Nell went off to serve. There's no wrong choice made out of love, sweetheart, Walter says, only different ways of showing it. Jo sits with that a long moment, watching the last of the daylight fade gold over fields that still belong to her family, safe for at least one more generation. Duke settles his head onto her lap with a contented sigh. Somewhere inside the house she can hear Eleanor's laughter, mixing with Ruth's easy and warm the sound of a family finally whole again. Later, alone in her room, Jo places the handkerchief and the patch back into the small wooden box, together, side by side, for the first time in 13 years. She closes the lid gently, thinking about everything this week has taught her. About how quiet strength and loud courage aren't so different after all, just two versions of the same stubborn love. About how a whole town, given the chance, chose to stand up for one of its own when it might have been easier to look away. About how even a boy raised to believe cruelty was strength found his way eventually toward something better, and how that kind of change matters too, even when it comes late and imperfect. About Ruth's quiet courage, closing her diner rather than serve men she no longer trusted. About Danny's willingness to say something isn't right, even to his own friends. About Whitfield's 22 years of quiet integrity finally called upon in the way that mattered most. She thinks about her mother's words, the ones that used to feel like a burden and now feel like a gift. Gentleness isn't weakness, just strength that hasn't been asked for yet. She thinks, too, about a lesson this whole ordeal has taught her about her own life, that asking for help isn't surrender, that letting someone else carry part of the weight, even someone states away serving a country that needed her differently than this farm did, was never a failure of her own strength. It was simply what family is for. Outside her window, the fields stretched dark and quiet toward the horizon, safe for now, protected by people willing to stand together when it mattered most. Somewhere down the hall she can hear Eleanor moving around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes being put away,
the sound of someone finally, truly home. Jo turns off her lamp, climbs into bed, and for the first time in over a week sleeps straight through until morning. Somewhere out past those quiet fields, an old truth settles over Millbrook, the same truth that's carried this small town through every hard season it's ever faced. Kindness costs something to give, but it costs far more in the end to withhold it. And the people willing to pay that cost quietly, without asking for anything back, are the ones who make a town worth calling home. Come morning, the sun will rise over Millbrook the same way it always has, same as it has for 100 years. But something in this small town has shifted for good, quiet and lasting as the fields themselves.